What's the smartest thing you've ever seen that still creeps you out? This one still messes with me because it wasn't just smart, it felt weirdly personal. Back in high school, I had this awful habit of forgetting my trumpet. The case was impossible to miss too, this giant black rectangle that basically screamed, "Hey idiot, you forgot me." One morning, I walked outside and the crows were absolutely losing their minds. Full-on feathered emergency meeting. It was so obnoxious I actually stopped walking, turned around and realized, yep, left my trumpet at home again. After that, it became a thing. For the next 4 years, if those crows started cawing like absolute lunatics while I was leaving for school, I'd stop, check myself, and sure enough, forgot the trumpet. Every single time. No false alarms, not once. The only times it failed were during winter when there just weren't any crows around, and those were usually the days I'd stroll into band empty-handed and get roasted by the director. That's the part that still fries my brain. Why would they even care? How did they connect giant black box with "this dumb teenager probably needs that"? What exactly were they getting out of making sure I didn't walk into first period looking like an idiot? 4 years is way too long to chalk up as coincidence. That's not random anymore. That's a routine. People say crows are insanely intelligent, and yeah, I believe it. But this felt less like intelligence and more like they quietly adopted me as the least competent member of their flock. Like they watched me every morning thinking, "There goes the bald crow again. Somebody remind him to grab the shiny box before he embarrasses himself." Honestly, I kind of miss those judgmental little weirdos. Story 2. My cat does something that still completely wrecks my understanding of what animals notice. She somehow knows when I'm about to get a migraine. I never trained her to do this. Honestly, I wouldn't even know how. The weird thing is, I don't get an aura or any real warning signs before a migraine hits. Most of the time, it just blindsides me. Except, every now and then, she'll quietly climb into my lap, lean over, and start licking one specific spot on my temple. Always the same side. Always the side where the migraine eventually explodes. The first couple of times I ignored her because she's a cat. Cats do weird stuff all the time. I figured she was just being affectionate. Then, about 15 minutes later, boom, migraine. After it happened enough times, I stopped arguing with the tiny furry neurologist. Now, if she starts licking that exact temple, I don't question it. I just grab my medication and get ready. She's been more reliable than my own body. As if that wasn't enough, she's also figured out lever-style door handles and can open doors by herself. She knows exactly where the treat bag lives, too. Every single day, at almost the exact same time, she'll walk over to the cabinet and start tapping the door like she's politely reminding customer service that my appointment is overdue. And then there were the keys. Somewhere along the way, she connected one very specific pattern. Human picks up keys. Human disappears. Problem. So she started hiding my keys, not knocking them off the counter because she's a cat, actually hiding them. I'd spend 20 minutes tearing the house apart before finding them tucked under furniture or shoved somewhere she'd batted them on purpose. I finally had to start keeping them where she couldn't reach them because apparently I was losing an arms race against an 8-pound criminal mastermind. She's just a completely ordinary black domestic shorthair. Nothing exotic, nothing famous. Yet almost every day she does something that makes me wonder how much is actually going on behind those eyes. It's like living with someone who's fluent in a language I'll never understand. Every once in a while we accidentally overlap for a second, and I realize she's been paying way more attention to me than I've ever managed to pay to her. That thought is somehow comforting, and just a little unsettling. Story 3. People don't usually think of rabbits as masterminds. They're adorable, absolutely, full of personality. But intelligence? Let's just say they tend to rank somewhere between chaotic marshmallow and tiny vegetarian with anxiety, which is why this completely caught me off guard. We had 2 house rabbits, Mr. Bun and Elsa. They had free run of the place and mostly did whatever rabbits do, which seemed to consist of randomly appearing, randomly disappearing, and occasionally sprinting through the hallway at Mach 3 for reasons known only to them. One day I was working in my office when Mr. Bun quietly appeared in the doorway. He just stood there, staring at me. That alone was weird because he usually had the attention span of a goldfish with a caffeine addiction. I laughed and said, "What is it, buddy? Elsa stuck in a well?" He didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring. Then he turned around and hopped away. A minute later, he came back. Same spot, same stare. At that point, I figured, all right, something's clearly up. So I got out of my chair and followed him. Sure enough, Elsa had managed to wedge herself behind a dresser. She'd squeezed into a gap she could apparently fit through going in, but not coming back out. Classic rabbit engineering. I pulled the dresser forward, just enough for her to wriggle free. The second she was out, she and Mr. Bunn touched noses for a moment, like everything was back to normal, and then they both casually hopped away. Mission accomplished. Here's the part that sticks with me. Mr. Bunn never did anything like that again. Not once. So, as far as I can tell, this wasn't some trick he'd learned. He saw there was a problem. He realized he couldn't solve it himself. He figured out a human probably could. Then he came and recruited one. For an animal I lovingly described as having approximately 3 working brain cells on a good day, that was a pretty incredible chain of reasoning. Sometimes intelligence isn't solving calculus. Sometimes it's realizing, I need someone else for this. Honestly, good job, Mr. Bunn, you little fluffy emergency dispatcher. Story 4. This isn't the smartest thing I've ever seen, but it completely changed the way I think about spiders. One day, I happened to glance over and noticed a spider crossing a doorway. Right as I looked at it, it froze. Not slowed down, not hesitated, completely froze. That caught my attention, so I started pretending I wasn't watching. I'd turn my head just enough to keep it in the corner of my eye. The second I looked away, it'd sprint across the wall. The instant I turned my head back toward it, freeze. We ended up doing this ridiculous little dance for a couple of minutes. Look away, spider runs. Look back, spider becomes a statue. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it kept happening over and over with perfect timing. That's when it hit me. The spider wasn't just aware that I existed, it was aware that I was aware of it. That's a whole different level of unsettling. I always pictured spiders operating on pure instinct, like tiny biological Roombas wandering around until they accidentally found a bug. Instead, this little guy was actively tracking where I was looking and changing his behavior based on my attention. It felt like realizing the background NPC in a video game had secretly been watching me the entire time. Now every time I walk into a garage or basement, I catch myself wondering how many tiny eyes are quietly keeping tabs on my movements while I go about my day completely oblivious. It's kind of humbling, honestly. We spend so much time assuming we're the only ones observing the world around us. Meanwhile, there's probably a spider in the corner thinking, okay, giant monkey looked away, go, go, go. And somehow that tiny shift in perspective made the whole world feel a lot less one-sided. Story 5. A buddy of mine in college had a couple of wolf dogs, and to this day, they're still the most unnerving animals I've ever been around. They were sisters, and from what I remember, they had way more wolf in them than dog. Most dogs greet you by wagging their tail, begging for attention, or trying to figure out if you brought snacks. These two, they'd sit on the other side of the sliding glass door and just stare, not glance, not casually watch, stare. The kind of eye contact that makes you suddenly aware of every awkward thing you're doing with your hands. You'd be talking to your friends, laughing, grabbing a drink, and the entire time they'd be sitting there without making a sound, tracking every movement like security cameras that had somehow developed opinions. Eventually, I asked my buddy what they were doing because it was honestly freaking me out. He looked over at them like it was completely normal and said, "They're studying you." I laughed. He didn't. Then he goes, "They're figuring out exactly how they'd take each one of you down if they ever had to." Now, I have no idea if that's actually true or if he was just messing with me. But after hearing that, every little head tilt suddenly felt different. Every slow blink, every tiny adjustment. It stopped looking like curiosity and started feeling like calculation. You know how a normal dog looks at you like you're the center of its universe? These two looked at you like you were a math problem. It felt like standing in front of 2 living chess computers that had already played out every possible move 5 minutes before you even walked through the gate. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were just waiting for someone to throw a ball. Or maybe my friend planted that idea in my head and completely ruined my ability to interpret wolf behavior forever. Either way, I've never forgotten those eyes. Most animals make you feel like you're watching them. Those wolf dogs somehow made it feel like they were the ones observing you and reaching conclusions you weren't invited to hear. Story 6. There was this guy in my neighborhood who absolutely hated the local crows. He'd yell at them, chase them off, throw stuff in their direction, just constantly picking fights with birds that clearly had way too much free time. Then one morning, they got even. His car wasn't just dirty, it looked like the crows had declared war. I'm talking completely covered in bird crap. Hood, roof, windshield, doors. The whole thing looked like it had been hit by a biological airstrike. Meanwhile, every other car on the street was perfectly clean. Not a little splatter, not bad luck, just his. The weirdest part? His car wasn't even parked in front of his house. It was halfway down the block, so somehow these feathery little mobsters knew exactly which random chunk of metal belonged to the guy who kept messing with them. That's the part that lives in my head. People think birds just see car. Apparently crows see Greg's car. And then, even worse, they seem capable of passing that information around like they're holding neighborhood meetings. Silver Honda. Guy's a jerk. Everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. I wish I was exaggerating, but the evidence was literally impossible to ignore. It looked less like random bird poop and more like a coordinated military operation. The avian equivalent of waking up to find your name on a very organized hit list. Honestly, I don't even feel bad for the guy. If you're gonna start beef with crows, you'd better be ready for the fact they can recognize your face, remember grudges for years, and apparently identify your car better than half the people at the DMV. Imagine losing a long-term feud to birds. Story 7. Back when I started working in video production, this was before editing on a desktop was even a thing. We were using machines that looked like they belonged in a NASA bunker, whole rooms packed with blinking lights, giant consoles, racks of equipment, and editors babysitting million-dollar systems that threw tantrums if you looked at them wrong. Every studio had a chief engineer whose entire existence revolved around keeping those monsters alive. At one place, ours was this short, bald guy who, on the side, had built his own satellite dish setup at home that could pull broadcasts from all over the world, which already felt like something only a movie hacker would casually do for fun. Then I'd watch him work. A machine would go down, everyone else would start panicking, and he'd calmly pull out this massive circuit board covered in hundreds of tiny components. Then he'd just stare at it, not poke it, not test it, not hook up fancy equipment, just stare for 20 or 30 minutes sometimes. The room would be dead quiet while the rest of us stood there pretending we understood what was happening. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the board, thinking it might as well be an aerial photo of a city. Every piece looked identical. My brain saw electronic alphabet soup. Then he'd suddenly point at one microscopic component. That one. Just like that. No scorch marks, no cracked solder, nothing visibly wrong. If you'd asked me to pick the broken part, I'd have had better odds guessing which grain of sand was guilty at the beach. He'd swap out that tiny transistor or resistor, slide the board back in. Everything worked, every single time. It honestly felt less like troubleshooting and more like he had some weird sixth sense for electronics. Like the circuit board was whispering, "Hey, I'm sick," and he was the only one fluent enough to hear it. Years later, I ran into someone who knew him and learned he'd apparently been taking acid almost every day back then. I have absolutely no idea whether those two facts were related. All I know is that while the rest of us saw a wall of random components, that guy somehow saw the answer. And honestly, I don't know which explanation is stranger. Story 8. The smartest thing that creeps me out wasn't from some genius or an animal, it was a 10-year-old. My stepmom is ridiculously sharp. She's the kind of person who sees through everyone's nonsense before they've even finished the sentence. You can't guilt trip her, you can't out-argue her, and you definitely can't throw a tantrum expecting it to work, unless you're my little sister. Watching those two interact is like watching someone pick a lock with a single paperclip. She doesn't throw fits anymore. She figured out those stopped working years ago. Instead, she'll quietly walk over, lean in, and say exactly the right thing. Not random whining either. She somehow knows which subjects my stepmom is emotionally soft on. She'll bring up one tiny, carefully chosen comment, wait about 5 seconds, and suddenly she's getting exactly what she wanted. Every single time. The creepy part isn't that she manipulates people, it's that she's already figured out which buttons belong to which person. That's a level of social pattern recognition most adults are still terrible at. Meanwhile, she absolutely hates trying it on my brother and me because it never works. She'll start her little script, and we're just standing there like, nice try. You can actually see her recalculating in real time, like a GPS hitting rerouting. It's honestly fascinating to watch. Some kids memorize multiplication tables. Mine apparently chose emotional vulnerabilities as her special interest. Watching it happen feels like seeing a tiny CEO negotiating a hostile takeover. No yelling, no drama, just a few perfectly placed sentences, and somehow the board approves the budget anyway. I love the kid. I'm also fully convinced that if she ever decides to get into politics or corporate law, the rest of us are absolutely cooked. Story 9. My mom still tells this story because apparently, at 4 or 5 years old, I was already running psychological experiments on adults. She was in college at the time, locked in her room trying to finish some huge assignment. Everyone had strict instructions not to bother her because she was buried in work. Naturally, I ignored all of that. I wandered into her room anyway. Instead of sending me back out, she caved and read to me for a little while. 1 book became 2. 2 somehow became 3. Kid logic is basically a denial of service attack on parental productivity. After I left, her boyfriend poked his head into the room and asked, "Hey, How many books did you just read to her? My mom looked confused. 3. Why? He completely lost it laughing. Apparently, on my way down the hallway, I'd stopped, looked him dead in the eye with all the confidence a tiny gremlin could possibly have, and said, I'm going to make my mom read me 3 books. Not ask, not hope, make. Then I marched into the room and executed the plan exactly as announced. Looking back, it's kind of unsettling. I wasn't reacting to what happened. I had already predicted the outcome before the conversation even started, like I'd watched enough adults to know exactly which emotional buttons to push. Kids don't understand taxes or mortgages, but somehow they can sniff out the weakest point in your resolve from across the house. It's like watching a tiny velociraptor test the electric fence before making its move. I wish I could say I've become less manipulative with age. Now I just get outmaneuvered by my own nieces instead. Karma's got a sick sense of humor like that. Story 10. I work for a regional parks department, and this is one of those stories I still can't explain without getting goosebumps. For years, we had indigenous human remains stored in one of the buildings on the property while everything was being sorted out for repatriation. Around that same time, the local Ravens absolutely hated us. And I don't mean they were annoying. I mean they had a personal vendetta. They'd rip the windshield wipers off our vehicles, dive bomb anyone walking across the site, steal keys if you were careless enough to leave them out, sit in the trees yelling at us like we were the worst neighbors they'd ever had. It wasn't random bird behavior. It felt targeted. Like every single day they were trying to make one thing crystal clear. You are not welcome here. We joke about it because what else are you supposed to do? It's hard to stay mad when you're getting bullied by flying goths with bolt cutters for beaks. Then, after years of paperwork and coordination, the remains were finally returned to the local nation and moved out to where they belonged. That same day, the Ravens stopped. Just stopped. No more dive bombing, no more stolen windshield wipers, no more missing keys, no more daily harassment. They didn't gradually calm down or lose interest over a few weeks. It was like somebody flipped a switch. After that, they went back to acting like normal ravens. I know there are probably a dozen explanations people could come up with. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe something else changed at exactly the same time. But standing there, having watched those birds wage what felt like a years-long protest, it was impossible not to wonder. Ravens are already famous for recognizing faces, remembering people, and holding grudges. That's well documented. What I can't shake is the timing. It felt less like wildlife changing its behavior, and more like they'd finally decided the problem had been fixed. Whether that's actually what happened or not, I honestly don't know. I just know I've never looked at a raven the same way since. Story 11. My neighbor once hand-raised a baby starling after its mom died, and that bird permanently changed the way I think about animal intelligence. At first it made sense. He took the little guy everywhere in his truck so he could feed him throughout the day, basically became this bird's full-time dad. Eventually, the starling got old enough to fly on his own. The problem was, nobody explained to him that the rest of us weren't also family. This bird decided the entire neighborhood was his friend. For whatever reason, though, I became the designated chauffeur. He'd land on the roof of my car and start yelling. Not random bird noises either. It was the same loud, demanding squawk every single time until I came outside. If I ignored him, he got louder. If I opened the car door, game over. He'd immediately try to hop inside like, finally, took you long enough, let's go. So I'd end up driving one lap around the block with a tiny feathered passenger living his absolute best life. This went on for about 6 weeks. The weird part wasn't that he liked people. Plenty of hand-raised animals do. It was that he had a specific request for a specific person involving a specific activity, and he had his own unmistakable way of asking for it. You'd be amazed how recognizable one bird's voice becomes when it's screaming the avian equivalent of, "Hey, road trip, get in, loser." After a while, I could tell it was him before I even looked outside. Some people hear birds and think they're all making the same noises. Nah, once one of them starts yelling directly at you every day, you realize they all have their own voice, kind of like people, which is somehow wholesome and deeply unsettling at the same time. I still laugh thinking about it. Imagine explaining to someone you're late because your neighborhood bird insisted on his daily cruise around the block. Nobody would believe you unless they'd met that little feathered weirdo. Story 12. I used to work for a nonprofit that helped adults with special needs, and one guy I met has lived rent-free in my head ever since. He was around 45, but he'd spent almost his entire life hidden away in his parents' giant mansion. No school, no job, barely any real contact with people. His whole world was old radios, stacks of almanacs, and whatever he could memorize. He even dressed in his grandfather's heavy wool suits from the 40s and 50s like he'd accidentally wandered out of a black and white movie. At first you figured, okay, nice guy, unusual life. Then someone tossed out a random date from history. Without hesitating, he told us the exact day of the week. So naturally, we kept trying to break him. Different centuries, random years, totally obscure dates, didn't matter. He'd answer almost instantly, and every single time we checked, he was right. Not close, not most of the time. Just right. The guy also had entire old radio programs memorized. Not just famous catchphrases either, full episodes. He'd drift into dialogue like he'd pressed play inside his own head. It was like watching one of those ancient jukeboxes where you hit a button and somehow the whole record is still sitting in there decades later, waiting. The unsettling part wasn't that he was some mysterious genius. It was realizing what a human brain can become when it's fed one tiny corner of the world for 45 straight years. While the rest of us were cramming useless trivia into brains that leak like busted buckets, his mind had basically turned into a living archive. The best part, though, is the ending. We helped him learn everyday life skills, trained him for a job, got him employed, and eventually helped him move into a group home where he could actually be part of a community. For all the bizarre stuff I saw working there, that's the one story I always come back to. Not because it was creepy, but because it reminded me that intelligence shows up in ways you never expect. Story 13. My mom got her horse, Blue Boo, when she was 12, and he was only a year old. They basically grew up together. Everyone knew he was insanely smart, but also a hot horse. Tons of energy, quick to react. Not the kind of horse you'd casually stick a beginner on unless that beginner had a death wish and excellent balance. Then I was born. My mom says the first time she brought me out to meet him, he spent forever sniffing me, really taking his time, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he made a decision. He turned around, shoved the rest of the herd back, and wouldn't let another horse get anywhere near my mom while she was holding me. Nobody taught him that. He just decided I was under his protection. From that day on, it was like he appointed himself my full-time bodyguard. This horse, who'd spent his whole life acting like he had somewhere incredibly important to be, suddenly became the calmest animal on earth if my mom rode him with me in a baby sling. No trotting, no showing off, just a slow, careful walk, like he understood there was precious cargo on board. As I got older, he took the promotion seriously. He'd shadow me around the ranch from sunrise to sunset. If I wandered too close to the creek or one of the irrigation ditches, he'd physically block me unless an adult was there. Strange dogs? Absolutely not. They weren't getting anywhere near me. If I climbed a tree, he'd stand underneath the whole time, pacing around and making a fuss until I came back down. Looking back, it's kind of ridiculous. Imagine having a 1,000-pound babysitter with hooves. When I was around 5, I started riding him by myself. We'd disappear onto the trails for hours, and I never worried about getting lost because he always knew the way home. Not usually, always. People like to say animals don't really understand us. I don't buy that anymore. Blue Boo didn't know English. He didn't understand ranch rules or parenting books. But somehow he figured out, completely on his own, that I was the tiny human he was responsible for keeping alive. He lived to be 43 years old. I still miss him. Some animals are pets. That horse was family. Story 14. I always tell people my Coonhound/Doberman mix is ridiculously smart, but it gets overshadowed by the fact she's also an anxious, high-energy disaster. She's 13 now, barely any gray on her chin, and still acts like she chugged 3 energy drinks before breakfast. Brain games? Nope. Nose work? Cute idea. 10-mile hikes? She'll nap for 20 minutes, wake up, and immediately start looking for trouble again. It's like trying to drain the ocean with a coffee mug. The moment I realized she wasn't just energetic, she was calculating, was one night when she asked my husband to let her outside. She stood by the door to the garage like she always does. He opened it, walked through to unlock the backyard, and our other dog took off chasing a tennis ball. My husband started throwing it, completely focused on the game. Meanwhile, this little criminal watched them for maybe 2 seconds, turned around, casually walked back into the kitchen, and started counter-surfing. Not because she wanted outside, because she wanted us outside. I figured it was a fluke until I started paying attention. Turns out she'd been running psychological operations on us for years. If I was cooking, she'd grab a shoe and parade through the kitchen with it. I'd instinctively chase her down, take it away, put it back. And by the time I turned around, she'd already inhaled the other dog's dinner. Other times, she'd fake needing to go outside just to clear the room so she could raid the counters. The worst part? She absolutely knows she's not supposed to do any of this. We took her through 3 levels of obedience training, and she graduated at the top of every class. She knows every command, every rule, every expectation. She just also knows that rules stop existing for about 30 seconds if she can manufacture a distraction. That's the creepy part. She doesn't just solve problems, she understands our behavior well enough to manipulate it. She's not thinking, food on counter. She's thinking, how do I get the humans to voluntarily leave the food unattended? And when you catch her, no guilt, no shame, no sad puppy eyes. She just stares at you like, yeah, honestly, that almost worked. I swear she's not my pet anymore. I'm just the unpaid security guard she keeps finding loopholes around. Story 15. People swear dogs are just animals, and I'm sorry, but that's straight up nonsense. Our 6-month-old Labradoodle escaped her first grooming appointment, somehow busted over a fence, got through a locked door, then sprinted 4 miles across London she'd literally never seen. Like, what GPS subscription is she hiding? My wife was losing it, and this fuzzy little menace was just sitting outside our 3rd-floor apartment like, y'all done panicking? A year later, she got scared during a run in another unfamiliar place and did the exact same thing. At that point, I quit pretending I understand how dogs see the world. It's like we're staring at a paper map while they're looking at the entire city glowing in neon. I hate admitting it, but that dog clearly knew something I never will, and honestly, that's equal parts impressive and deeply irritating. If you enjoyed this one, stick around. There are plenty more wild stories coming.